Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to the Peaceful Solution Character Education Certification course. Everyone that's here can be seated. Those of you coming in, feel free to find your seats when available. And for those of you online, let's see, a lot of countries watching online that I got messages from, so we'll try to greet all of you that I've got so far. So, hola, habari, shalom, salut, ahalan, and previ. So, the last one, Russia, which is really a great thing to see with knowing what's taking place over in Ukraine and with Russia and the European Union. It's always great to see many people tuning in to the Peaceful Solution Character Education program. And of course, once again, a reminder that you can download our books. The one we're going through tonight is the Self-Control Unit. And you can download the PDF version, and it's free. It's there on Facebook. If you're watching, you just click that drop-down menu. You'll see where the character unit is at. And you can also download the Acceptance Unit and the Self-Control Unit. And, of course, they're all teacher's manuals, which is what you're going to want. We've explained, if this is your first time watching, the teacher's manuals are different in the student's manuals. As far as the lesson plans are only in the teacher's manuals, the note to the teacher and the guidance to teaching the class is there for the teacher, only in the teacher's manuals. And of course, you have the answers to the questions too that's there for you. But once again, the Peaceful Solution, one reason that it reaches, so many countries and so many people tuning in is because no matter what religion you are, I just greeted both the Jewish nation and the Arab nations. No matter what faith you are, we all have this common agreement on morality and the treating of mankind when it gets down to it. Nobody wants to be stolen from. Nobody wants to be abused. We just have to find that answer that we're searching for, where no one has any kind of harm that befalls them. And, of course, that's what we're working on here in the Self-Control Unit. We're in Chapter 3. We're concluding Chapter 3 tonight, actually. You can be turning over to your lesson plan there. It'll be LP 3E. And, of course, David finished up there in the Procedure 8. So we're going to start off with Procedure 9. But, of course, as always, you have to pay attention to the pages there. And you see that page 81 concluded Procedure 8, and then Procedure 9 starts with letting us go to the poem, Foolish Anger, on page 83. So let's make sure to turn over really quickly to page 82, and we're going to read this quote here from the Peaceful Solution. Then we will read the poem, and then we'll go back and we'll rehearse what we've learned, which at the end of every chapter, the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program, there's always a rehearsal to build up for the next lesson. Remember, as we put these lessons together, as teachers, we have to remember that we're building these lessons one upon the next, and they're like building blocks. And there's no rush to get through these classes. There's nothing that says you got to cram it all in and hope they remember it and get to the next thing. No, this is a class where you take your time and you make sure the points are gotten. And if you have classes of 30 and 50, that can be difficult, but you never want to go, as the author of the Peaceful Solution always told us, never go faster than your slowest student, because once they grasp it, it'll last them a lifetime. And of course, your slowest student is not really that, we're not saying they're slow in learning, but sometimes comprehension compared to what they've been taught at home. The old adage where, if someone does you wrong, you get back, you fight back, you tell them, if I find out you come home and someone has beat you up, well, just wait till you get home, you're going to get it worse. And this is kind of things that's put into the mind of children, and sadly, this leads into them being adults. And of course, for an adult to say that, somebody had to put it in their mind also. But that's really not a problem solver. That's, when we see nations do that, we call it war. When we see individuals do that, sadly, it can get to where it's called crime. It can be assault. It can be murder. It gets to be pretty bad things whenever these emotions aren't controlled. But here on page 82, it says, take a bite out of this. Fighting back is not the best way to handle a situation. It is guaranteed to only make the situation worse. Refusing to fight back is not a sign of weakness. Rather, it is the sign of positive moral strength and self-control. Anybody can raise a fist. It takes far more intelligence to think your way out of a situation. Just show how intelligent you are. And this, of course, is by evaluating the situations and learning how to deal with them. But you know, a lot of people, a lot of youth, especially if you're being bullied, and we're going to get into that as we progress through the peaceful solution, they feel like the only way to get the bully off the back is to, you know, bring a bigger weapon, bring something more powerful than what they're bringing against them. And we see that leads to a lot of actions that are not only harmful to the individual or the bully, but it spreads out from there into the schools. And we've seen that just kind of go rampant in the last 20 years. You know, we just had the anniversary here just a few weeks ago of Columbine High School, which was back in the 90s. And we remember these things, but we haven't actually stopped them. And I remember a commercial that was put out by some youths back in the middle, around 2015. And one of the things they said was we would rather have classes taught or be educated than have a memorial made of their death. And of course, these memorials that are made, they're made to remember these people. And it is a tragedy what takes place. By no means am I downplaying that. But we are judged as a society by what have we done to make it better so this will never take place again. And of course, making a memorial to remember them, remembering the cause of something is one thing, but preventing it from taking place again, that's the challenge. And that's truly what everyone really should seek. And that's what the peaceful solution is striving to do globally. Now, here on page 83, now, if you get this from the peaceful solution, if you purchase the book, or you can request it, this is actually an MP4 where it's read by one of our teachers. And a lot of the plays and the poems that you'll find in the peaceful solution, you can request the MP4 files. If you get a teacher's version that we have up for the schools, the MP4s are embedded into the book itself. So if you actually had this, for example, Foolish Anger, the teacher could just click, there would be a little box there on the PDF file, and the teacher could just click it, and one of our teachers would read it. And of course, someone that's really decent at reading poems, not like me, somebody that was really rehearsed in it could do very well. And it helps the class with the continuity, and it helps with remembering certain things. So here with Foolish Anger, it says, resentment, outrage, fury, wrath, and rage. We learn these forms of anger at an early age. Hitting, screaming, and stomping feet later turned to fighting and warring in the street. From playground shootings to killing in the halls, anger was the motivator behind them all. Bullying and other forms of abuse come from those who have let anger loose. Anger unleashed is hard to tame. Its victims are never the same. A person controlled by anger is held in a vice. Losing self-control can cost a hefty price. Your health, freedom, or worse. Is uncontrolled anger worth a ride in a hearse? Controlling anger is an acquired trait. It must be learned, but it's never too late. Self-control is a useful tool. It will make a wise person out of any fool. You know, and then remember, as we're going to rehearse tonight, as you turn over to your next page here on page 84, and this is the What I Have Learned section, and we'll tie in just more than chapter 3. We'll also take a look back into chapter 2. If you remember, that was entitled Controlling Your Emotions to Your Advantage. And then chapter 3 here is Controlling Your Anger. And putting all of these things together as we build and looking forward to coming in to the very next class into chapter 4, which will be applying self-control to interaction and communication. And with that itself, we're building towards the next book, which is respect. And all of these things will tie in together as we move forward. But once again, each piece of this puzzle, you can say, or ingredient to a recipe, they're very much needed to bring about the complete package of moral character. And these are things that we at the Peaceful Solution say are just as important as teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, character education, is needed in every situation. So looking over here to page 84, and these are the bullet points that we have from chapter 3, and we're going to look back and go over them one more time and cover them so we can build on moving forward. And the first bullet point here, to what I have learned, it says anger is a normal emotion that all people experience at some point in life. And remember, as you turn back over to page 33 first, we're going to look back into the previous chapter, page 33, because that's where we actually read about the definition of anger and how it's a normal emotion. And remember, a lot of people, I would say most people, when it comes to anger, they confuse anger with rage. And we'll get into that moving forward, but rage is when it really gets out of hand. It's where it becomes abusive. It's where harm can take place to someone. You know, anger, as you look over here to page 33, you see the definition here for anger. And it says, anger is a normal emotion that is experienced by everyone. Yeah, no one's immune to it. Everyone is going to experience anger at some time in their life. However, it is actually a secondary emotion. That means that anger is felt as a result of other emotions that have not been appropriately resolved. And if you didn't underline that appropriately resolved, underline it now, because we'll take a look back as we move forward about how these things, when left unresolved, shelved, displaced, they eventually erupt. But notice here it says frustration, embarrassment, annoyance, and jealousy are all primary emotions that, if left unchecked, can result in anger. So once again, you have a primary emotion such as embarrassment that, if left unchecked and undealt with, can lead to anger. Now, if it leads to anger and you're upset because something has taken place that you don't agree with, when that's not controlled, look down to the next paragraph here, the next definition. We have the definition of rage. And rage, once again, is anger that is uncontrolled, and that can result in rage. Rage is a dangerous emotion that can lead to verbal and physical abuse, and in extreme cases, even death. And if you haven't made a note there, write down chapter 2 of the character unit. Because remember, that's where we went over the dysfunctionality of families, and we learned that physical abuse is just as harmful as verbal abuse, or vice versa. Verbal abuse is just as harmful, sometimes more harmful, and the reason I say more harmful is because it's more readily available. You know, verbal abuse doesn't leave the scars on the skin. You know, it doesn't break bones, but it can really break someone down from a mental state. And you see that taking place continually when you see people that's in society, and it's like, man, they're on the up and up. They're movie stars. They've got their own TV shows or famous singers. And then you see in the news every week, a person died. I just seen in the news yesterday where a 16-year-old who was on a certain show, I don't remember if it was Discovery Channel or the Learning Channel, 16 years old, and they took their own life at 16. You know, and it's sad because you think a person had so much to live for and so much ahead of them. They had just begun to even experience life. And really not even really experiencing it yet, experiencing what's offered through, the school system, but getting out there and having a career and learning to, help make other people's lives better by the way you conduct yours. Well, something went very wrong in that situation, and it's not to speak bad about that person, because there's nothing there to speak bad about other than they lost hope and they took their own life. Well, that's what we're talking about with this anger, because anger can lead to rage, and that rage leads to saying, doing, insulting, doing and saying things that lead people to, when they go home, they contemplate it. And it can really be very damaging in the mind of not just a young person, but also an adult. Also, looking over here to page 57, remember we learned that the anger is a normal emotion. We just read that definition. And here we find another paragraph, and we're re-emphasizing this once again on page 57. And this was the introduction into chapter 3, which was controlling our anger. And the second paragraph here, it says, once again, anger is a normal emotion that we all experience at times. So that's one thing we have to accept. Anger is perfectly normal. Children and adults all experience anger for one reason or another. There are as many reasons for people to get angry as there are people. What might make one person angry might make another person laugh. And keep that in mind, because when someone is angry, does that mean that you see someone and they're upset, they're in disagreement with something? There's nothing wrong when a person says, "Can you give me a minute? I'd like to collect my thoughts." That could be their way of cooling down, as Catan and David spoke about, with the hot thoughts and the cool thoughts. And, you're being respectful when someone, even if you can't tell they're upset and you're asking them a question and they say, "You know what, can you give me a moment?" It's being very disrespectful to, "Well, I just have a question. Can't you just answer my question?" Well, that's not the way to deal with it. Sometimes we need to let people have the opportunity to process these emotions. And that is truly a sign of someone that is practicing positive moral character. When they take that time, take a deep breath. And that doesn't mean if someone in authority asks you a question, you throw the hand up. "Nope, not right now. You're going to have to be quiet and leave me alone." That's not the time to do it. You wouldn't do that to your authority, your parents, your guardians. You wouldn't do that to your supervisor at work. That's not going to get you very far. But there's nothing wrong with saying, "Hey, I'm trying to work through something right now. Can you give me a moment?" It's all in the way we actually reply also. Easier said than done when a person is angry. But here, looking back over to page 84, because there's a lot of these bullet points that are going to tie together, and we're going to go back to the same pages quite a few times, so we don't want to read it all at once. We want to emphasize a couple of these points that are being made here. The second point you'll find on page 84, and what I have learned, it says, anger can be dangerous if it is uncontrolled and allowed to turn to rage. It affects the way I communicate and interact. It also affects the way I feel about myself. Now, looking back over to page 57, and there in that second paragraph, we kind of left off there in the middle of it. We finished with what makes one person angry and what might make another person laugh. But continuing on here, notice it says, whether or not we get angry depends on our personality and character. So it takes both of them working together. Although all people can experience anger, it can be dangerous if uncontrolled. It can affect the way you communicate and interact. It can also affect the way you feel about yourself, and that's your self-worth or your self-concept. If you start seeing or feeling that you have no value, if you don't see value in yourself, it'll be really hard for other people to see value in yourself. It's kind of like self-respect that we've only briefly touched on, but we're going to get into more as we proceed. If you don't respect yourself, you'll never respect someone else. Well, if you don't value yourself, it's going to be hard for other people to see value in something you don't see value in. It's the basic concept of commerce and doing business. If you try to sell something to someone, what do you try to do? You try to find everything you can find about this product to make it sound as valuable as possible. And you'll point out things that are just kind of common sense, like selling a car. The tires are really, they're black. And the red car is really red, and the glass, you can see through it. These are obvious things, but you start pointing out all this value that, well, it's supposed to be that way, but, you're making it sound like it's worth more just by telling me that. But these are things that when we go through in society that if someone, things I've seen in schools that we've experienced, people with speech impediments to where they, and I don't want to imitate it because I know that's very derogatory, but people that have a hard time pronouncing words correctly to where they have a lisp and the mouth doesn't work all the way together. I don't have a speech impediment, but I still have a problem saying words. But these are people that are born and their mouth will not allow them to be able to say, and it sounds a little different. And people can be very ridiculed. Now think about that. Ridiculing and bullying someone who they themselves cannot control the form of their mouth. They cannot control the way the tongue works with the roof of the mouth and off the front of the teeth or the front of the mouth line itself. So they have no control over these things. And making someone feel like they're less valuable, they're less educated, or as they would say, these are words that you hear. You're stupid, you're dumb, or so forth. And that's not true. That doesn't determine a person's self-worth. But when someone says that, imagine, would it be right for someone to be angry if someone told them they were stupid or dumb? Well, yeah, that just means that they don't agree with it. That would be perfectly normal. But how do they process it at that point? What do they do? Look back over to page 33 really quickly, at the very top. And this is something that, you can't read enough because it's very important. On page 33, and then we're going to look at we're also going to look at page 31. But the very top of page 33, it says, although all emotions can affect the way we behave, there are some emotions that have a greater potential to lead to negative behavior. And then looking back over to page 31, you have these negative emotions. And notice once again at the very top, it says, generally speaking, emotions can be categorized as either negative or positive. But notice once again, and I hope everyone has this underlined by now and highlighted, uncontrolled negative emotions are hurtful and can undermine your growth. That means it can prohibit your morality, the growth in morality, to becoming a better person, someone who's always striving to make the right choice. Well, it can undermine your growth, development, and your future. It will actually limit you to how far you can go in life, or to how long your life could actually be. And notice it says they can also damage your interactions. Nobody really wants to talk to someone. If you've ever talked to someone that always seems miserable, no one wants to be around, even though they say misery loves company. It's kind of like, a drunk. Not even a drunk wants to be around a drunk. It becomes annoying. A thief doesn't want to be stolen from. And someone, who is bullied, you would think, they'll never bully anyone. Well, as we move forward, we'll learn that when these things aren't dealt with, the person that was bullied eventually becomes the bully, if it's not dealt with. And they've only repeated. It's kind of like putting a program in a computer. Whatever was downloaded in, that's what comes out as soon as they find somebody who seems weaker to them. Now, there are some people that do, many people, that find a better way to deal with it. And they're able to get past that in their life. But the thing that's most important is you never lose that, seeing that value in yourself. So once again, on this second bullet point here that said anger can be dangerous if it's uncontrolled and allowed to turn to rage. And notice we read it affects the way I communicate and interact. It also affects the way I feel about myself. Well, look over to page 58 also. And notice here the facts about anger. And we're going to read through these once again in this process. And this, if you can imagine anger, and it's always helped me see it in my mind as a pot of water that's on a stove like a pressure cooker. And the more you turn the heat up, it'll start to rattle. And eventually it'll blow the lid right off the thing. And when the lid comes off, people really get hurt. Well, on page 58, here are some facts about anger. And this is one that can be probably the most challenging for people. And it's the statement, no one ever makes you angry. You choose to become angry. But that's a very factual statement. And when a person will honestly take that statement, go through everyday life, and realize when a situation comes up, they have the ability to get upset about it or to process it through in a proper way, and realize that, it's not the end of the world. It's like, heaven forbid when you're 18-year-old, somebody put a scratch on your car, just the smallest of scratches. And that can be life or death. I remember being at that age, and man, I would wash and wax my car every week. I would wash it 2 or 3 times a week. I would put newspaper underneath the floor mat so no dirt got on the carpet. Now that I'm 49, I look at it a lot differently. I'm like, I don't have time for all that. It's going to get cleaned eventually, sooner or later. And sadly, my car that I own today is worth a lot more than the car I owned at 18. But you learn in life there's some things that are very important, and I'm not saying that maintaining things aren't, but, some things, when it gets dirty, you can clean them. Well, when you start damaging human beings or animals, any life form, when you start bringing things harmful upon things that are alive, whether it be a human, an animal, smacking your dog because you're angry is not the right thing to do. And then getting mad when the dog bites you back, well, you should expect you smack the dog, he's going to try to defend himself. And I've heard people say that before. I hit my dog, and can you believe it bit me? It's like, well, I can't believe it only bit you once. I guess it maintained its control there, I guess, after it lost it for a second. But once again, no one ever makes you angry. This is something to prove this to yourself as you go through the day. You choose to become angry. Whether you realize it or not, you make a conscious choice to respond to an individual or situation with anger. Anger, like all other emotions, is fueled by your thoughts and how you understand the world around you. If you think negative thoughts that fuel and justify your anger, then you're making a choice to be angry. And there's certain jobs that people deal in that this is something you have to be able to control. Customer service for a company, that is something where you really have to learn to control your anger. And we found out a very interesting experience. Here, I've had AT&T phone service for years, and it's not the best phone service sometimes. And I've called customer service before, and I noticed when you call customer service, you either get, well, I knew one country was India, but I didn't really know who the other country was until we went to Argentina to teach the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program. And one of our classes we taught was customer service of AT&T. And, you would think walking in there, like, these are great jobs in Argentina. These jobs are desired. They don't want to lose these jobs. And when we walked in the classroom, great people. They had great personalities, and you could just tell that they were people that, are used to helping you feel better about problems. And then the class started, and it was like, well, what's the biggest problem here? And it was depression. And they were telling us, do you know what it's like your job is to help people solve their problems? Do you know how many people cuss you and scream at you and threaten you? And they say all these things about your family and every other thing. And keep in mind, these people, that was their second language, English. They speak Spanish. So these people went to school to learn how to speak English just so they could be insulted, understand what was being said to them. And they were people that they loved their jobs, but the depression and the way that they felt was mind-blowing. And I started really thinking about, man, next time I call customer service, I'm going to be mindful about how I say stuff to people, because this site that I seen on the other side was a lot of really great people. And when you're customer service, when someone's cussing you out, you can't lose control of your emotions and start cussing them back. You're going to lose your job. And that's true with every customer service. There's certain jobs, if you can't control your anger, you will never have a job in customer service. No one's going to pay you to work at, whether it be a Walmart, a Lowe's, a Home Depot, or so forth. When a customer has a complaint, well, you just unleash on them. The best thing for you to do is just go to the other side of town, go to the other store. That's the best thing for you to do. Just get out and never come back. That's not the ideal situation for you as a business owner if you have employees out there. Well, once again, anger being the secondary emotion, and we read that definition for anger. We've confirmed it, and here's the third time. And, of course, we first read that on page 33. It says, in other words, speaking of anger being a secondary emotion, in other words, when someone says something to us that we disagree with, we usually don't feel angry immediately. Although it might seem as if anger is instantaneous, anger is produced by other emotions such as embarrassment, disappointment, hurt, annoyance, and of course even fear. And notice here the third one, it says, anger that is uncontrolled can turn to rage. Now, anger is a normal emotion. Once again, we want to get that into our minds. It's perfectly normal to be angry. But when you see people cussing people out, throwing things, threatening people, hitting people, that's not anger, that's rage. That is uncontrolled anger. There's a fine line there that means life or death. But a lot of times people define it very wrong. Anger, once again, being this normal emotion, but the way we choose to respond, once again, might be anything but normal or healthy. When anger is expressed in healthy ways, people are able to resolve their differences in a peaceful manner. That just means there's a disagreement, like with customer service. You call customer service because you got a problem. You call them, you're probably upset. You're paying for a service. You're not getting what you think you should get. They solve your problem. You feel better. If you're not disrespectful to them, you solved your problem in a peaceful way. And, you don't hang up your phone still angry because you solved the problem. If you solve a problem and you're still angry, it's more than just a problem that your anger is bullying over there. But once again, anger that is expressed in unhealthy ways can result in someone being hurt or property being damaged. This is called rage. So I asked you a question. I want you to think about this. We talked about here property being damaged, uncontrolled anger. So if one country is upset with another and you start shooting missiles at it, is that the proper way to deal with anger? Innocent people always live. It's the guilty people that die in war, right? When you think about the horrors of people burning to death in fire and families losing loved ones, you always see this in the Middle East. They're digging through piles of rubble. Here you have a parent holding a child, and a lot of people say, oh, that's just put up there for TV. That's not true. I've learned in my journeys through life and travels around the world, yes, people really die. Yes, parents do hold their dead children when they find out they've died. Yes, there are some really horrific things that take place in our society. And no, not everything is just too bad to be true. It's almost like cancer. No one thinks about it until they or someone really close to them gets it. And then it becomes real in their life. Now it's affecting them. It's the same thing when you see here, when you have property being damaged. Whenever we see, I see William sitting down here in the front row. Let's say me and William got into a confrontation. And William decided to shoot some bottle rockets over at my house one night. And I decided, well, you know what? I'll go get a multi-cocktail. I'll just throw it back through his window. And here we're just waging war with each other. Now, we're both going to go to jail for that because that is against the law. But when nation does against nation and these bottle rockets are missiles that destroy and annihilate, they actually say there's rules to war. There's ethics to war. Well, the peaceful solution would challenge and say that's failure in society. Whenever you're taking human life, whenever you're victimizing families, whenever people are suffering damage to property, you're talking about economies here in Ukraine and other countries completely shut down, like in Yemen. And we say as a society it's being dealt with properly. No, that's not true. Whenever it's dealt with properly, people do not suffer. Whenever rage takes over, that's when you have harm. That's when you have the property damage, people being hurt. That's when you have suffering. So we as a society need to honestly look back and say, how do we deal with this where people don't suffer? And there's always this first thing, well, you got to get rid of the bad people. Once we get rid of the bad people, everything will be better. That's kind of a line that's went on for 6,000 or some odd years. We've had one war after another war, after another war, after another war, and once again, we're always trying to get rid of the bad people. Well, why? Well, because the bad people are angry. Well, then then just contemplate this, and I'm not trying to down any nation, but if I say I'm controlling my anger, I'm just going to shoot a couple missiles over there and get the guilty people. A couple $1 million missiles at a couple $100,000 buildings, or $100 million missiles at a couple buildings that cost $100,000. Think of all the work and labor that went into buying these missiles to destroy these $100,000 buildings that really didn't solve any problems whatsoever. And I've always laughed at the theory that if I shoot your family member, that's going to cause you to like me more. Never really worked. Hurting someone has never caused someone to like someone more. Hatfield and McCoy was a great example of what takes place when, these family feuds get involved and they grow. But once again, it says rage is dangerous, excessive anger. People who are enraged lose their ability to think clearly. Like, let's shoot some missiles at that building. That it'll only get the guilty people. The innocent people that are around, it won't hurt them. If you really think that, I would encourage everyone on this rage. I'll finish this and I'll give you something to reference. It says people who are enraged lose their ability to think clearly. They become driven to lash out verbally or physically. Rage has led people to inflict serious physical injuries on other people and even to commit murder. And if you've never, and this is not an endorsement for the film, but it's a great film to watch. If you've ever, or if you have not ever, seen the film White Light, Black Rain, I would encourage everyone to watch that. It is a documentary about people that had to live with the aftermath of the atomic bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. And it's people telling their stories about the deformities, the burning, the suffering their families went through, and all of the things that, the United States readily says, well, we put an end to the war. But you look at what was taking place and the people that still to this day, there are people still living from it. They're almost a generation that has died off. But you still have generations past them that are still suffering from the results that came from that blast. The people that died in the immediate detonation, well, they were what they would say the lucky ones. It's the ones that didn't die that suffered the burning, the flesh melting, the eyes being burned out of the sockets and so forth. These things actually took place. And to see the people tell their stories, you can see when we see this war, and well, why is that important? There was just another news show today that I was watching. I see this every day. They're repeatedly saying nuclear war has never been more readily available than since the last time the atomic bomb was dropped than it is today. People are now saying that tactical nuclear weapons are now acceptable. That means larger bombs, more deadly things to take place is considered an acceptable way with dealing with situations. Well, no, it's not. That's rage. It's uncontrolled anger. And we can see that in society. But once again, going back over here to page 84, remember when solving the world's problems, we have to solve the problems that starts in our household with ourselves, then our families, our communities, our cities, our states. And yes, it can spread out. We see it spreading out all the time. That's how the peaceful solution is in so many nations right now. But turning back over to page 84, notice once again, continuing with what we've already read, no one can make you angry. No one can make you angry. We read that there on page 58, but we're going to continue in that. And it says, anger is a choice I make. There are both healthy and unhealthy ways to handle anger. I'm only responsible for the choices I make. And of course, we read through that on page 58. We tied that together with the bullet point before that. But also look over to page 61, or page 60 first. Look over to page 60 first and notice anger can hurt. And that's what we're building on, is that no one makes us angry. Anger is a choice that I make, and there's healthy and unhealthy ways to deal with anger. And here on page 60, where it says anger can hurt, notice it says learning to control your anger is one of the most important skills you can learn. So once again, it's something we have to learn. You're not born knowing how to speak. You're not born knowing how to walk. And you're not born knowing how to deal with situations that lead to anger. And of course, for that skill, if you look back over to page 46 and underline that word skill, it's kind of like, people who play sports, they practice continually. And it's a never-ending process of developing these skills. Well, controlling anger is also another skill. And on page 46, at the very bottom of the page, is talking about the STOP acronym. And at the very bottom of the page, it talks about the implementation of the STOP acronym, which of course is stop, think, consider your options or your choices, and then proceed with the right choice. It says, as with any new skill, self-control is developed through, notice, determination, practice, consistency, and responsibility. It's something we have to work at. It's not something that you take and let me put some of this like lotion to get rid of dry skin. It doesn't work that way. It's not like, it's a lot like, you can compare it to hunger. When you're hungry, you eat something that helps you feel better. But you're going to have to do it again because you're going to get hungry again. So you eat more, it makes you feel better. Same way in dealing with emotions. When you have an emotion such as anger come up, when it's dealt with appropriately, the situation resolves itself and it goes away. But if you deal with it inappropriately, it's like eating something that had, some kind of bacteria in it. And now you're going to suffer. And off you go to the hospital because you have projectile vomiting. The body's rejecting what took place. Well, that's what it's like when you deal with it inappropriately. And then you realize, man, I don't want to do that again. I don't ever want to do that again. And then what do? They do it again. You forget the lesson that was learned. And also looking over to page 71. Page 71, notice we're in control of whether we become angry or not and how we deal with it. In page 71, it says, you are responsible for controlling your anger. Once again, putting it on ourselves, that I language that David talked about in the last class. Once again, no one can make you angry, and no one can control your anger except you. It's really unfair to think that someone else can control your anger. That person made me angry. Well, okay, they made you angry. Now, what are you going to do with it? Well, I don't know. I might have to slap them. That'll fix everything. Well, let me ask you something. If you did something that made someone angry, and possibly you didn't know you did something, and they chose to become angry. If they walked up and slapped you, and you didn't even understand what's going on, is that going to make the situation better? No, they slapped me, so they made me angry, right? That's what someone's going to say. I wasn't angry till they did something to me. No, not really. I've been slapped before on a city street, and these things that I learned was going through my mind, and it led to me just walking away. And I remember that, and I remember being slapped before in a situation, and I yelled some choice words that I shouldn't have yelled, and I felt really bad. That was long before I found out about the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program. But I can tell you it worked out a lot better by just walking away from the situation. And honestly, I don't even remember what the person looked like. Haven't seen them since. They live in a different state, 1,500 miles, 1,200 miles away. And it's just a part of life that you like to look back and say, well, at least I dealt with that appropriately. Hopefully I can continue to do that. Not that you want someone to come smack you to find out whether you do it or not. If you want it, sometimes it comes. But once again here, it says, in the same manner you choose to be angry, you can choose to handle anger in appropriate ways. You can choose to avoid causing harm to yourself and others. Controlling your anger means making a conscious choice not to let your anger get the best of you or not allowing it to turn to rage. By being aware of your anger triggers and anger style, you can take steps that will lead you to making positive choices even when you feel angry. It's kind of like you have to set goals and work to those goals, as we talked about in the acceptance unit, writing them down, reminding yourself, when these situations come up, I'm going to control them. I'm going to deal with them appropriately, and then I can move forward. Well, here back on page 84, because we still have a lot to cover, page 84, on the fourth bullet point, it says, anger is a secondary emotion. To control my anger, I must identify my primary emotions. So looking over here, let's turn to back to page 61 again. Page 61. And keeping everything that we've read so far together, question of the day, why do we get angry? If you ask people, and I've experienced this myself, when someone says, why are you upset? And you really got to sit there and go, I really don't know. Sometimes a person can be angry and they even forget why they're upset. It's like going into the room to grab something, and when you get in the room, and what did I come for? But if you've ever been upset, a lot of time it's these influences that come in from different directions. And we've talked about anger displacement and, of course, the way anger is dealt with. But a lot of times people get the result of other people's anger, and they're not even involved in the situation. And sometimes people can't honestly tell you. When your children get angry, ask them, why are you upset? A lot of times they can't even identify it. And that doesn't mean they're lying. They really might be having a hard time. Even as adults, we have a hard time identifying why we become angry sometimes. So never underestimate it with a child. Notice here it says on page 61, it says, we often get angry because we experience something that is unpleasant or our expectations were not met. People get angry for many different reasons. These reasons are called triggers. From the previous chapter, you learned that a trigger causes something to occur. An anger trigger could be something that provokes, frustrates, or aggravates us. A trigger could be a person, situation, or experience. On other occasions, it is our own false perception that trigger our anger. Because we are all unique individuals, what provokes one person might not necessarily provoke another. However, it is fair to say that many people experience similar triggers or anger traps, get you caught in there from time to time. In other words, once you choose to be angry, a particular trigger can consistently invoke angry feelings. This following is an exploration of some of the following triggers, and it gets into feeling a little insecure. Notice the very first one. It says, a common trigger lies in taking the random comments and actions of others as if they were intended to be personal. And looking over to the next page here with jumping to conclusions. And a lot of these things, notice it says on page 62 that insecurities can also lead to jumping to conclusions. Jumping to conclusions simply means arriving at a false belief due to a lack of accurate, truthful information. If you've ever seen an optical illusion, then you are familiar with how easy it is to be tricked by what we see. And a lot of times people can create scenarios in their own mind that are very false. They're not true. And when you're doing that, it's really hard to identify why you're angry. You usually have to identify the anger by identifying truth and factual information. If you're angry because, that person over there I heard said something. Well, did you ask them? Did you ask them if there's a problem? Did you try to work it out? Did you find out that they might not have said that? You can take, and a lot of people do this in their classrooms. We've done it with children before, where you take a line of 10 people, 20 people, and you start off with a scenario. And it's just 2 sentences. And you have this person repeat it to this person, repeat it to this person. And you write it down, and you're going to need to write it down because the 20th person that, and you get to the end, okay, what did you hear? It's always very, very different from the original story that was told. And when you're getting second, third, fourth-hand information about what someone said about you, and it could be, that person did a great job. Sometimes it's a challenge, but that person did a great job. And by the time it gets back to you, you did a great job one time, but it's usually a challenge for you to do anything right. And then you become upset. And then you find out that that's not even what was said. It eventually grew to that through people, spreading certain comments, and it gets out of hand. Well, that's something, once again, identifying, getting the facts, being able to process. Looking over page 74, too, because there's something there we want to read on page 74 about identifying. Page 74 at the very top, talking about cool thoughts. Make sure you have factual information whenever someone says something. And it says, cool thoughts will help you to separate from your anger long enough so that you can identify your primary feeling. You're wanting to know what's causing it. Remember, anger is a secondary emotion. When you identify the underlying feeling, you can better control yourself and handle your emotions appropriately. And once again, when you're getting all the facts in these situations, if the anger is burning because you think someone said something about you, and then after you find out, that really never took place, that should in itself help the feelings start calming down. You would never want to get even or fight back with something to find out that that person never really did anything to you to begin with. That leads to wars. Looking back here on page 84, continuing along here, it says conflicts, this is the next bullet point. Conflicts are not an excuse to become angry. Conflicts are simply disagreements between people with different opinions, needs, and wants. I'm willing to look for a compromise and apologize to diffuse the situation. Here on page 63, we have the section entitled Work It Out, Don't Fight It Out. And I've had young men and young women when we were teaching in schools that's nothing I'll ever need in life. Nope. They'll see it my way or they just won't see it. And I've always responded the same way to everyone. Man, you're going to be single for a long time. This is something that every marriage needs. Work it out, don't fight it out. Oh, no, they'll always do what I say. Well, that's not what life's all about. Everybody doing what you say. We all have to work together in this world, as David uses that term synergistically. One thing affects another. For every action, there's a reaction. And here on page 63, it says, another common anger trap lies in abusive behavior as a means to resolve conflicts. Just because you have a conflict with someone does not mean you have to resort to verbal or physical abuse. And as we read in chapter 2 of the character unit, these are very damaging. These things lead to suicide. They lead to people not being able to fulfill their full potential in life. It takes away to where they can't even see their own self-value. It destroys self-concept. It can really damage someone for a lifetime. Once again, it says conflicts are simply disagreements between people with different opinions, needs, and wants. It's kind of like the old Chevy, Ford, Dodge disagreements. Man, there can be some heated disagreements. I've seen the most heated disagreements between people that are not old enough to drive. And they will argue to no end over Chevy, Ford, and Dodge, and none of them have ever sat in the driver's seat of anything. Maybe a golf cart. And I find it humorous. And I used to deal with some young men, and oh man, the very heated discussions that would take place over that. None of them have ever driven any of those things. And I know one of them drives a Ford now, and I don't remember which he was supporting when he was younger, but I know he drives a Ford now. Once you get old enough, you realize I don't really care what symbol's on the front of it. As long as it does what I need, that's all I care about. I could hardly care less which one it is. But once again, it says here, conflicts are simple disagreements between people with different opinions, needs, and wants. As you learn in the next chapter, respectful communication and interaction, as well as listening to each other, can resolve any conflict a lot faster than anger ever could. And that's one thing to keep in mind. Whenever, like customer service we were talking about, and it's one thing they teach you in dealing, if you ever have a business and you have a customer that's upset, the first thing you have to do and learn is they're upset, don't stop them. Let them get it off their chest. And once they get it off their chest, try to navigate your way into what is the actual problem. And they're upset, but sometimes people voice that they're upset and they call names and they bash the company or whatever, but they still never told you what the problem was. So you have to just let them get through it, process it. They're doing it wrong. You have to control yourself the whole time, and then you have to listen to what's being done. Now, I'm talking at that as a business standpoint. That also works the same way with a student teacher or a child to the parent. If a child is really upset and the parent's just going to go, yeah, I don't want to hear it, just go away. No, don't want to hear it. And then one day your child does something and you're like, well, why didn't you come say something? Well, I tried. For years, actually. And you kept saying, I don't want to hear it. So now I'm sitting here being charged with a crime. Now you want to hear it? It was kind of late now. Now I'm going to suffer for this. But we have to be mindful, this communication, when conflicts arise, the only way to solve a conflict is to process it. And a lot of times they're not as difficult as we make them out to be. The next bullet point here on page 84 is feeling angry as a result of a series of steps. These steps involve my triggers, thoughts, and feelings. In learning to control my anger, I must, underline that, I must be aware of all the steps that lead to anger. And of course, we went over that on page 64. You see the anger sequence. And the first one being triggers, the second one being hot thoughts, and then the third being feelings. And of course, then we had on page 65, know your anger cues. And some people might go through every one of these, and and reading them as your heart beats faster, you can actually hear it pounding, your body temperature changes, you feel really hot or cold, you start speaking faster, start speaking louder, you start to tremble or shake, you breathe faster, your face gets flushed, you clench your fist, you grit your teeth, you get an upset stomach. Most of these things that we just read about people getting angry, people go to the emergency room for a lot of these things. So it's probably something we need to look at. That's not too healthy to be doing this, as we've went over already. Not processing emotions appropriately, actually, they can break us down from inside eternally, affecting our organs even. It affects our health in general. But once again, understanding these sequences help us process the anger more appropriately. And in the very last one here, the bullet point, it says, when I handle my anger appropriately, I speak in a respectful tone of voice and use respectful words. I also choose to behave in a peaceful way. I am willing to seek help from those who care about me. I'm willing to seek a compromise and apologize. Even if I know I'm right, I am also willing to walk away when possible. And I want to give you these pages because we won't have enough time to go through all of them, but write these down by this bullet point. Pages 34, 45, 69, 72, 73, 74, and 76. We do want to, when I handle my anger appropriately, turn over to page 72. We do want to read at least a couple of these. And this is something that Catan covered, along with William, about start controlling your anger. And the very beginning here, it says, by changing your concept of anger. This is the way you think about it. Remember, everything starts with a thought, and then feelings, then actions. So by changing your concept of anger, in other words, understanding how it takes place, you can change the way you behave and act when you're angry. So once you understand the process, we can understand how this emotion works, and we can bring better results to the situations. Notice it says, by now you have grown accustomed to responding to what triggers your anger by reacting in a certain way. That's your anger style. Doesn't mean you can't change it. Styles change all the time. If you don't think it does, go look at a house that was decorated in the 60s. You'll want to change it immediately. But if you wait long enough, it'll come back around again. And everybody will go, wow, you got the latest, greatest stuff. Yeah, it's only 70 years old. It's great. And that's really how things work. It says, hence you respond to anger by either giving someone the silent treatment, which solves 0 problems, internalizing your anger, which is like a pot boiling out on the stove, cursing, which doesn't do anything, that's like adjectives for people, or lashing out, retaliating, or a combination of all of these. Well, lashing out's not going to solve problems. That can be with the tongue or with the fist. They're both just as harmful. And of course, when you put a combination of these together, you never bring anything to positive results. But the key part of this is changing your concept of anger, educating ourselves, understanding what's taking place and why it's taking place. And then look over here to page 74, the very top of page 74. And we're going to close with this part. We'll read the comment at the bottom once we get done with this. And it says, cool thoughts on page 74, the very top. Cool thoughts will help you separate from your anger long enough so that you can identify your primary feeling. So once again, remember, anger is a secondary emotion. This means we have to be educated. And this is the second time we're actually covering this paragraph. We have to be educated to identify it. Then we have to practice this. It becomes a skill. Remember, that means bring it back to thought. Anger is a secondary emotion. When you identify the underlying feeling, you can better control yourself and handle your emotions appropriately. So once we have that in mind, we can better do that. And of course, look over really quickly, page 76, because there's some really neat points we had here to help us, to remind us. On page 76, you'll see these bullet points here about use your positive character traits. That's one way. Think of the humility that it says and the compassion that can help deal appropriately with anger. And then you see the next one, if possible, walk away and take time to cool down. The key word is if possible. If a parent is talking to a child or a teacher to a student, a supervisor to an employee, if the supervisor, parent, or teacher is dealing with it appropriately, they will allow the person some time to also think about what they're going through. If someone in that authoritarian position is being very rude and disrespectful, they're not helping the situation whatsoever. And notice also here in that black box on page 76, holding on to resentment is like drinking or like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. That's about how much sense it makes when we hold on to these things, this get even and fight back attitude. Well, looking back over to page 84, at the very bottom it says, showing self-control is a sign of moral strength. And it's a sign that you're identifying things, we're processing it, we're thinking about it, and we're putting it into action. And once again, if you just joined us and this was your first class, if you go back through and watch our previous classes, you're going to see the teachers go through and expound on these things into detail. We just did a basic summary of chapter 3, but you'll be able to go back and see in detail where these things were dealt with very thoroughly and a lot of other points brought in to help this process of identifying these emotions. So that's going to conclude for chapter 3. Our next class, we're going to do the introduction in for our next class of chapter 4. That's going to be this coming Sunday. It'll be the 8th. This coming Sunday. It'll be from 5:30 to 6:30. And chapter 4 will begin to discuss applying self-control to interaction and communication. But once again, we're going to be building off everything we've covered thus far. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.